He left her because she couldn't give him a child. For years later, he saw her with a little girl who had his eyes. Andrew Blake's home was immaculate, elegant, and empty. A sprawling estate overlooking the water, it had been designed to impress, to reflect power and precision, qualities Andrew was known for in every corner of the business world. Yet behind the flawless walls and curated furniture, there was a silence that clung to everything. It wasn't peace. It was absence. The kind that creeps into your bones when the person you once loved no longer walks through the door. He had left her, Celia, the woman who once painted colors into his monochrome life, 4 years ago. At the time, he told himself it was logical. They had tried everything to start a family. Doctors, specialists, procedures. Every month brought hope, followed by disappointment. Celia had suffered quietly, her smiles becoming rarer, her light dimming more each year. And Andrew, who thrived on solutions, couldn't fix it. He grew distant, restless, and bitter, not toward her, but toward the silence in the nursery that never held a child. The day he left, he didn't pack much. Just a suitcase and a few lines rehearsed like business strategy. "It's not your fault. I just can't live like this anymore." Celia didn't cry. She stood in the doorway, barefoot, her hair pulled back, paint smudged on her shirt, and said nothing. That silence haunted him more than any scream would have. Now, 4 years later, Andrew had everything he thought he wanted. His company had doubled in value. He was on the cover of magazines, had dined with politicians, and had just bought a new penthouse in Manhattan. But when he came home each night, it was always to silence. Not even the city below could drown it out. Sometimes he thought of her, where she might be, whether she still painted, if she ever regretted letting him go so easily. Other times, he told himself it didn't matter. He had made a choice, and he had built his empire without distraction. That should have been enough. But it wasn't. One evening, after another long day filled with strategy meetings and perfectly meaningless conversations, Andrew found himself driving without a destination. The car moved through quiet streets, passing shops and people and places that felt more alive than he had in weeks. He pulled over outside a small art gallery on a corner he didn't recognize. The windows were fogged, but through the glass he could make out soft lights and watercolor canvases hanging on the walls. Something pulled at him. He didn't go in, but he stared for a long time, until the clerk inside turned and caught his gaze. Embarrassed, he turned the key and drove off. He hadn't thought about Celia in weeks, not really. But that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he saw her again. Not the woman in the gallery windows, but the one who used to fall asleep with paint on her fingers and hope in her heart. The one he had left behind when life didn't go according to plan. And for the first time in years, he wondered not just what she was doing, but whether she had ever forgiven him. The next morning, Andrew woke up restless, his mind replaying images he hadn't invited, Celia's face in the soft morning light, the quiet way she used to tilt her head when she was painting, the nervous way she would laugh when he caught her dancing barefoot in the kitchen. These memories came not like a flood, but like raindrops, small, cold, and impossible to ignore. He tried to push them away, like he always had, but something felt different this time. It was as if the part of him he buried with their marriage was finally clawing its way back to the surface. He didn't go to the office that morning. Instead, he sat in his car outside a coffee shop they used to visit years ago. It was still there, same awning, same chalkboard sign offering handwritten quotes with your latte. Back then, Celia had always smiled at the silly tradition. He remembered one she kept in her wallet for months, asterisk, some storms come to clear your path. Asterisk, she'd said it was about them. At the time, he had only half listened. Now he couldn't stop listening to the past. With a sudden impulse, he pulled out his phone and searched her name. Nothing concrete. No website, no recent exhibits. He scrolled further, then deeper into social media. After nearly 20 minutes, he found a tagged photo. It wasn't much, just a blurry snapshot of a community art fair, but there she was, standing in front of an easel, her hair longer now, her smile softer, more inward. She wasn't alone. In the corner of the photo, just visible at the edge of the frame, was a small hand gripping hers. Andrew stared at the photo for a long time. Something twisted deep in his chest. The girl, he could only assume it was a girl, was mostly out of the shot. But her presence was unmistakable. A child. He zoomed in instinctively, though the quality was poor. All he could see was dark, tousled hair and a soft pink sleeve. His mind raced, doing math without reason. Celia had been pregnant when he left. No, she couldn't have been. He would have known, wouldn't he? Unless she hadn't told him. Unless she'd found out after. Unless. He shut off the screen. This was ridiculous. It wasn't his business anymore. He had made his choice, and Celia had moved on. But the image refused to leave him. All day, he tried to bury it under emails and phone calls, under numbers and meetings and empty conversation. But none of it worked. For the first time in years, his focus fractured. By evening, he gave up pretending. He drove. He didn't know her new address. But the art fair in the photo had a location tag, a community center on the other side of town. He told himself he was just curious. That he wanted to see if she was okay. He didn't plan to talk to her. He just wanted something. A glimpse. Closure. The neighborhood was older, quieter. Not the kind of place he would have pictured her ending up, but somehow it felt fitting, charming, lived in, human. He parked across from the small building and waited. The sun had already started to fall behind the trees, casting long, sleepy shadows across the sidewalk. People came and went. A group of kids rode past on scooters. A couple with a stroller passed by, laughing softly. And then he saw her. She walked out of the community center, holding a small child on her hip. Andrew froze. It wasn't a guess anymore. The girl had her hair. Thick, dark, soft curls that framed her face like a halo. But it was the eyes that made his breath catch. Wide, brilliant blue. His eyes. Celia looked tired, but peaceful. She was dressed simply, jeans, a cardigan, a bag slung across her shoulder. She looked like someone who had stopped chasing and started living. The girl was talking excitedly, her small hand pointing at something across the street. Celia laughed, kissed the top of her head, and turned toward a nearby cafe. Andrew sat frozen behind the wheel, 1,000 thoughts crashing at once. He had questions. Too many. Why hadn't she told him? Why had she kept the child from him? Was it even possible? But beneath all that, deeper and quieter, was something else, guilt. He had left her. When she had been breaking, he had turned away. And now, she had built something beautiful without him. He didn't follow them into the cafe. He stayed in the car for nearly an hour after they disappeared inside, staring at the sidewalk, his heart a war zone. He thought he had moved on, believed he had chosen the life he wanted. But in that moment, watching his daughter's laughter bounce off the walls of the street, he realized he had walked away from more than a marriage. He had walked away from his family. And now he didn't know if he deserved to find a way back. The next morning, Andrew woke up with a tightness in his chest that no amount of coffee or logic could shake off. He had spent most of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself that what he saw wasn't real, or that even if it was, it didn't matter anymore. But the more he tried to suppress it, the more his thoughts unraveled. The little girl's face kept appearing behind his eyelids, her blue eyes full of life and curiosity, so achingly familiar that it almost hurt to recall. There was no more denying it. He had a daughter. And he didn't even know her name. By midday, the pressure inside him had turned into a kind of restless determination. He couldn't go another day without answers. Not out of entitlement, but because the weight of silence was unbearable. He had never been a man to avoid confrontation, and now that the confrontation involved his own flesh and blood, retreat was no longer an option. He called in sick for the first time in over a decade. He didn't have a plan, but he drove back to the same neighborhood, hoping for another chance. He parked outside the cafe and waited, watching the sidewalk like a man waiting for a miracle to repeat itself. Hours passed. People came and went. At one point he got out of the car, walked into the cafe, and ordered something just to blend in. He didn't ask about her. He couldn't bring himself to say her name aloud. Not yet. Late afternoon finally brought movement. Celia appeared again, this time walking alone with the little girl holding her hand. The child was skipping, humming something softly, her energy bounding ahead while Celia followed calmly. Andrew stepped out of the cafe, his heart pounding so loudly it felt like thunder inside his chest. He didn't know how to do this gently, so he did the only thing he could, he walked toward them. Celia saw him before he spoke. Her body stilled. Her hand instinctively tightened around the little girl's, and for a split second, she looked like she might run. But she didn't. Her eyes met his, steady and unreadable. Celia, he said, the name catching on his throat like a memory he hadn't spoken in years. She stood still, not speaking. The child looked up at him curiously, then back at her mother. "Hi," he added, softer now. "I didn't mean to scare you." "You're not scaring me," Celia said calmly. "Just, surprising me." There was a silence between them that stretched like fabric pulled too tight. "I saw you yesterday," Andrew admitted. "I didn't know you lived around here." I didn't know about her. At that, Celia's eyes darkened slightly, her expression tensing. "You didn't want to know. You made that choice a long time ago." He winced. "I didn't know you were pregnant when I left." "If I had." "If you had," she interrupted, her voice quiet but firm, "would you have stayed out of guilt or love?" That question hit him harder than he expected. He opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. The little girl looked up again, tugged gently on Celia's hand, and whispered something. Celia bent down and nodded before turning back to Andrew. "This is Lily," she said at last. "She's 3.5. She loves coloring, strawberry ice cream, and asking 10 questions in one breath. And no, she doesn't know who you are." Andrew's throat tightened. He knelt down slowly, careful not to overwhelm the girl, and offered a soft smile. "Hi, Lily," he said gently. She blinked at him, tilting her head slightly. "Are you Mommy's friend?" He glanced up at Celia, who gave no answer, then looked back at Lily and said, "I'd like to be." Lily smiled shyly, then hid behind her mother's legs. Celia let out a long sigh. "What are you doing here, Andrew?" "I don't know how to answer that in a way that doesn't sound selfish," he admitted. "I just saw you, and everything inside me shifted. I didn't come to demand anything. I came because I lost something I didn't even know I had, and I can't ignore that now." She looked at him for a long time, her face unreadable. Then she said, "I don't know what you expect." "I don't expect anything," he said. "I'm not here to rewrite history. I want to know her. I want to know you again. If you'll let me." Celia didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at Lily, who was now twirling the edge of her dress and humming. Then she looked back up at him and said quietly, "We go to the park every Saturday morning. If you want to come, you can." Andrew felt something inside him break open, something buried and forgotten, now suddenly breathing again. He nodded slowly, overwhelmed by the quiet permission in her voice. "Thank you," he whispered. Celia gave a small, guarded nod, took Lily's hand, and turned to go. Andrew watched them walk away, the little girl bouncing along the pavement, and he realized that in all his years of chasing fortune and legacy, nothing had ever mattered more than the chance he had just been given. And this time, he wasn't going to run. Saturday morning arrived with a soft breeze and pale sunlight warming the sidewalks. Andrew was already awake before dawn, pacing his penthouse apartment as the city stirred to life below him. He hadn't felt this unsettled in years, not before a merger, not even before testifying in front of a Federal Trade Commission. This was different. This was personal. He had spent the entire week rehearsing what he might say, imagining different outcomes, preparing himself for rejection, confusion, even anger. What he hadn't prepared for was the weight of hope pressing so heavily on his chest. He arrived early at the park, dressed casually, something rare for him. A navy polo shirt, jeans, clean sneakers. He'd stood in front of the mirror twice, debating whether he looked approachable or like a man pretending to be someone he wasn't. In the end, he chose honesty. Let her see him as he was. A man who had made mistakes. A man who, despite all his success, had no idea how to fix what he had broken. The park was quiet, mostly filled with joggers and a few parents pushing strollers. He sat on a bench near the playground, watching the morning come to life. It wasn't long before he saw them, Celia and Lily, walking hand in hand down the path. Celia wore a simple gray sweater and light blue jeans. Her hair was pulled into a loose braid. Lily was in a soft yellow dress with tiny flowers embroidered along the hem, holding a small stuffed fox in one hand and skipping slightly with each step. Andrew stood as they approached, uncertain whether to smile or stay neutral. Celia gave him a short nod, polite but cautious. Lily didn't say anything at first. She looked at him curiously, clutching her fox a little tighter. "I told her you might be here," Celia said. "I didn't tell her who you were." "That's okay," he said. "I wouldn't even know how to explain it." There was an awkward pause, then Celia gestured toward the playground. "She usually starts with the swings." "Can I push her?" he asked, unsure if he was overstepping. Celia looked at Lily. "Do you want Mr. Andrew to push you?" Lily considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Only a little high," she said solemnly. Andrew smiled, following her to the swing set. He gently helped her into the seat, his hand surprisingly steady. It had been decades since he'd pushed a swing, but the motion came back naturally. With each push, Lily giggled louder, the kind of laugh that shook something loose inside him. Joy, real and messy and unfiltered. Celia stood nearby, watching them with folded arms. Not cold, but not relaxed either. Andrew knew she was still measuring him, weighing whether his return was genuine or convenient. And she had every right to. After a few minutes, Lily asked to get down. She ran off to the sandbox, and Andrew joined Celia on the bench. "I didn't expect her to warm up to me so quickly," he said. "She's open," Celia replied. "But she's not naive. She picks up on more than people think." "I don't want to confuse her," Andrew said quietly. "I don't want to confuse you." Celia looked straight ahead, her voice measured. "Then be honest. Don't promise more than you can give." "I'm not here to make promises I can't keep," he said. "But I want to try. I want to be in her life, even if it's slowly." "You left," she said bluntly. "You left me when everything was falling apart. And I carried all of it, alone. I was scared out of my mind. I almost didn't keep her." Those words hit harder than he anticipated. He turned toward her, eyes wide with shock. "I'm not proud of that thought," Celia continued. "But it's the truth. I was grieving the marriage, grieving what I thought was a broken body, and then suddenly I had a life growing inside me and no one to share it with." "I didn't know," Andrew whispered. "No," she said softly, "you didn't. And I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to come back out of obligation. I wanted to protect her from a father who didn't know if he wanted to be one." Andrew stared at the ground, shame curling in his stomach like smoke. "I wish I had stayed. I wish I had seen it through." Celia nodded, not unkindly. But you didn't. And I had to build something from that. I had to become someone new. So if you want to be in her life now, it has to be as the man you are today, not the one you were. He nodded slowly, understanding more in that moment than he had in years of therapy and boardroom self-reflection. I can do that. Or at least, I want to learn how. Celia turned to look at him, her eyes softer now. Then we'll start small. He looked over at Lily, who was now building a castle out of sand, her brow furrowed in determination. He couldn't believe he had missed so much. But he was here now. And for the first time in a very long time, Andrew Blake didn't feel like a man chasing a legacy. He felt like a father trying to earn a place in the world he never knew he'd wanted. As the morning unfolded, Lily came back to show them her castle, and Andrew crouched down beside her, genuinely impressed. Celia watched the two of them interact, careful, gentle, and almost familiar. She couldn't decide if it filled her with comfort or fear. Maybe both. But she knew one thing, something had shifted. And she wasn't ready to trust again, not yet, but she wasn't walking away either. The weeks that followed became a quiet rhythm Andrew hadn't known he needed. Every Saturday, without fail, he showed up to the park before Celia and Lily arrived. Sometimes he brought books for Lily, sometimes a coloring set, and once he even brought a tiny kite shaped like a fox after remembering the stuffed animal she always carried. Celia noticed the small efforts. She didn't comment, but she watched him closely, testing whether this consistency was just a phase, a performance, or something real. So far, it seemed real. And for Lily, it became something she looked forward to, something she trusted. She no longer hid behind her mother's legs when Andrew approached. Instead, she often ran up to him with stories of her week, proud drawings, or a new question about something completely random, why clouds were soft, or where turtles sleep at night. One Saturday, the air turned cooler, and the leaves had begun to change. Celia brought a blanket and a thermos of tea for them to share while Lily ran between piles of leaves, collecting the brightest ones to press in her notebook. Andrew sat beside Celia on the blanket, trying not to let the closeness make him say something premature. He knew this new phase between them was delicate. As they watched Lily balance on a fallen log, arms stretched like wings, Andrew finally asked something that had been circling in his mind since the day he met her. "What does she know about me?" he asked, careful not to let his voice shake. Celia hesitated, keeping her eyes on their daughter. "She knows that her dad left before she was born. That he didn't know she existed. She knows that I raised her alone, but that she was never unloved. And now, she knows that someone named Andrew is starting to become important in her life." He nodded, swallowing the weight of it. "Have you thought about telling her more?" "I've thought about everything," Celia said, and there was a tired truth in her voice that made him ache. "I thought about what it would do to her if you came and went. I thought about whether you'd confuse her. I even thought about lying and saying you were a family friend who moved away. But none of that seemed right. So now I'm just taking it one day at a time. Watching you. Watching her. Trying to figure out if this is something that's going to last." Andrew turned to look at her, his voice low. "I'm not going anywhere." She gave him a long, searching look. "You said that once before, remember?" "I do," he said honestly. "And I broke that promise. But I'm not that man anymore. I didn't know what it meant to stay then. I thought love was about perfection, and when things got hard, I thought leaving meant strength. I was wrong." There was a pause, the kind filled with years of unsaid things. Lily ran over, interrupting them, her cheeks red from the wind and her hands full of leaves. She dropped them on the blanket with a proud smile. "I'm gonna make a tree book," she declared. "One page for each kind." Andrew grinned and helped her sort through them. "That's a great idea. You'll be a leaf scientist." "No," she giggled, "a leaf queen." Celia laughed too, watching the exchange with a strange sense of calm. It had been so long since she'd seen Lily this open with anyone outside of her. Later that day, as they were packing up to leave, Lily suddenly turned to Andrew and asked, "Can I tell my friends you're my friend too?" Andrew crouched down to meet her eyes. "You can tell them I'm your friend," he said carefully, "and maybe one day, we'll be even more than that." Lily seemed to consider this deeply, then nodded and reached up to hug him without warning. It was small, quick, but it felt like the ground shifted beneath his feet. On the drive home, Celia didn't say much, but before he turned to go back to his car, she said softly, "If you really mean to stay, you need to start building something with her. Not just on Saturdays. She needs more than promises." Andrew looked at her, almost afraid to be hopeful. "Would you let me come by during the week? Help with dinner? Homework? Bedtime stories?" Celia didn't answer right away. But then she nodded slowly. "You can try." And that single word, try, meant more than any yes he had ever heard. Because it wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was the beginning of trust. And trust, Andrew realized, was worth everything he had to give. By the time October settled in, the evenings arrived sooner, and the air held a constant crispness that hinted at winter's approach. Andrew had slowly become a fixture in Celia and Lily's routine, like a bookend to their days, never overwhelming, never forcing himself in, just present in small and meaningful ways. He would stop by twice during the week, once for dinner and once just to help Lily with her bedtime routine. It wasn't always smooth. Sometimes Lily was tired and cranky, sometimes she ignored him altogether. But then there were moments, quiet, rare, powerful, where she reached for his hand during a bedtime story or asked him to stay a little longer. And every time she did, something inside Andrew shifted further into place. Celia, too, began to relax, though she never said as much out loud. The first few visits had been cautious, almost clinical. She set boundaries. She stayed in the room when he read to Lily. She reminded him gently not to promise anything he couldn't keep. But as the weeks passed, she stopped hovering. She'd step away to the kitchen while he helped Lily brush her teeth. She let him carry Lily to bed when she fell asleep on the couch. And once, without realizing it, she let him wash the dishes while she sat quietly at the table, watching the steam rise from her tea. It was during one of those evenings that something unexpected happened. Lily had gone to bed early after a long day at preschool, and Celia and Andrew found themselves alone in the living room. There was soft jazz playing from an old speaker in the corner, and the lamps cast warm pools of light across the shelves and old wooden floor. Celia curled up in her armchair, a blanket around her legs, while Andrew sat on the edge of the couch, a mug of tea in his hand. They talked more freely now. Not just about Lily, but about everything, her paintings, the classes she'd taken over the years, the small gallery that had once featured her work. He listened, really listened, in a way he never had before. Back then, he had always been distracted by a meeting, an email, some crisis that felt more urgent than what was right in front of him. Now, he found himself hanging on to every word she spoke, quietly stunned by how much he had missed, about her, about the life they might have had. After a lull in the conversation, Celia looked at him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "Why now?" she asked. "After all this time. What changed?" Andrew took a long breath. I think I finally stopped running from everything I didn't want to face. I kept myself so busy building things, growing the company, chasing success, because I thought that would fill the space. But it didn't. I was always empty. Always angry. But then I saw you. And her. And everything inside me cracked open. Celia didn't speak for a while. She just watched him, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her cup. "You weren't the only one who broke," she said eventually. "But I didn't have the luxury of running. I had to grow up all at once. I was terrified. But Lily made me brave." He nodded. "She's making me brave too." There was a kind of silence between them then, not awkward, but heavy with something unspoken. It was the weight of grief, of time lost, of paths that should have gone differently but somehow still led them here. Eventually, Celia stood and gathered her cup. "I'm glad she has you now," she said simply. "I never wanted to keep her from you. I just didn't know if you were someone I could trust with her heart." "I didn't know either," Andrew said quietly. That night, he left later than usual. When he reached the front door, he turned back to her and hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" She looked up. "Of course. Do you think I'll ever be forgiven?" Celia's expression softened, but there was no easy answer in her eyes. "Forgiveness isn't a door, Andrew. It's a hallway. You've started walking through it. That matters." The next morning, Andrew woke to a text from Celia. It was a photo of Lily, still in her pajamas, holding up a drawing she'd made. The picture was simple, 3 stick figures standing under a tree. One had brown hair, one had blue eyes, and in the middle, a little girl with a bright yellow dress and a crooked smile. Underneath, written in large, uneven letters, were the words, "My family." He stared at the photo for a long time, the corners of his mouth lifting into a smile that reached all the way to the part of him that had once gone numb. He had a long way to go. But for the first time, he knew exactly where he was headed. It was early November when things began to shift in a way Andrew hadn't expected. The days were shorter now, darkness falling quickly in the late afternoons, and with it came a certain stillness that seemed to settle into their lives like a gentle hush. Lily had started asking more questions, about the past, about where Andrew lived, about why he hadn't always been there. She wasn't accusatory. She was simply curious, as only a child could be, sensing that something about her world had changed and wanting to make sense of it. Andrew did his best to answer honestly without giving her more than she could carry. He told her that sometimes grown-ups made mistakes, and that the biggest mistake he ever made was not knowing about her sooner. He told her that he had missed a lot of her life, but that he wanted to be there for every moment he could from now on. Lily listened carefully, her small face serious, and then, after a pause, she had asked if he would come to her school's family day. He had said yes immediately, without hesitation. The event wasn't grand, just a morning of classroom activities, songs, and crafts where parents or guardians came in to spend time with the children. But for Andrew, it might as well have been a summit with world leaders. He had spent his entire life in rooms of power, yet none had made his palms sweat the way the idea of sitting in a circle with preschoolers did. Still, he showed up early, carrying a tray of homemade cookies he had barely managed to bake the night before after watching 3 YouTube tutorials and nearly setting off his apartment's smoke alarm. Lily was already in the classroom when he arrived, wearing a pale blue dress and her favorite sneakers with stars on the sides. She ran up to him, arms outstretched, and hugged him without hesitation. Celia was there too, standing off to the side, watching with a quiet smile that said more than words ever could. She hadn't told him he had to come. She hadn't even reminded him the night before. But when she saw him standing in that brightly colored room, holding his uneven cookies and nervously straightening his sleeves, something in her softened even more. During the event, Lily proudly introduced Andrew as her special person. When one of the other children asked if he was her dad, she hesitated only a second before saying, "Yes. He's my daddy now." Andrew's heart clenched at those words, the finality of them, the unquestioning acceptance. Celia had looked over when she heard it, her expression unreadable for a moment before she gave him the slightest nod. Not permission exactly, but acknowledgement. Later that afternoon, back at Celia's apartment, the 3 of them sat on the living room floor, surrounded by craft paper and glue sticks, admiring the drawings Lily had brought home. There was one she had made that day, a picture of a house, a sun, and 3 people standing hand in hand. Celia had long hair, Andrew had tall shoulders and blue eyes, and Lily stood between them, her smile big and her crayon crown slightly crooked. "I want us all to live together someday," Lily said casually as she colored in the grass. So I don't have to say goodbye at bedtime. Neither Andrew nor Celia responded right away. The moment was too fragile, too real. Andrew looked at Celia, uncertain what he was allowed to hope for. He didn't want to rush anything. But he also didn't want to pretend he didn't long for that too. That evening, after Lily had fallen asleep, he lingered a little longer than usual. Celia walked him to the door as always, but this time she didn't open it right away. Instead, she leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her gaze meeting his. "She's starting to expect you," she said softly. "It's no longer a surprise when you show up. It's part of her world now." "I know," he replied. "That's what I want." "And what if something happens? What if you get scared again? What if your life pulls you back into that world of meetings and travel and late nights?" "I've already stepped out of that world," Andrew said, his voice steady. "I've turned down projects. I've started saying no. And for the first time, it doesn't feel like I'm losing anything. It feels like I'm finally building something real." Celia watched him for a long moment before nodding. "She's not the only one who's starting to expect you." That admission, small as it was, hit him like a wave. He didn't kiss her that night. He didn't ask to stay. But when he left, he walked away with a hope he hadn't dared to hold before. The hallway to forgiveness, as Celia had once called it, was long. But step by step, he was moving forward. Not with words or promises, but with presence. With proof. And sometimes, that was the bravest kind of love there was. Winter came quietly that year, blanketing the city in soft gray skies and a hush that seemed to wrap itself around everything. For the first time in years, Andrew found the cold comforting rather than isolating. There was something peaceful about the way the world slowed down, how people leaned into warmth, into each other. His life, once filled with noise and motion, had become something simpler, measured not in profits or deadlines, but in bedtime stories, warm dinners, and unexpected moments of laughter. He had started spending evenings at Celia's more regularly, helping with Lily's nighttime routine, sometimes cooking, sometimes just being present. At first, it had felt like visiting someone else's life, beautiful, but temporary. Now, it was beginning to feel like his own. There was a mug with his name on it in the cupboard. Lily had drawn his face next to hers on the family calendar. And Celia no longer stood between him and the stove when he cooked. It wasn't dramatic. It was the slow, almost imperceptible unfolding of trust. One night, just before Christmas, Lily fell asleep curled between them on the couch after watching a holiday movie, her fingers still sticky with melted marshmallows. Celia looked over at Andrew, her eyes tired but soft, and whispered, "She calls you Dad when I'm not around. She says it like it's always been true." Andrew couldn't speak for a moment. He simply looked at the small, sleeping figure between them and felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for so long, peace, purpose, and something close to redemption. As the year came to a close, so did many of the questions that had once haunted them. Celia no longer held herself back from small touches, her hand brushing against his when passing him a dish, her shoulder leaning into his on cold evenings. And Andrew no longer walked into her home with hesitation. He brought groceries without being asked. He fixed the broken light in the hallway without making it a grand gesture. It was these quiet acts that made Celia begin to believe him. Not because he said the right things, but because he had learned to show up without needing to be praised for it. On New Year's Eve, Celia invited him to stay for the night. It wasn't romantic, not in the traditional sense. She simply said, "You're part of this now. If you're tired, stay." He nodded, and that night he tucked Lily into bed, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Happy New Year, sweetheart," before returning to the living room, where Celia waited in her robe, a cup of tea in her hands. They didn't talk about the past that night. They didn't dissect what had gone wrong or weigh the pain against what they had now. They just sat side by side, watching the fireworks bloom quietly in the distance through the frosted window. And when midnight came, he turned to her, not with grand intentions or carefully crafted words, but with honesty. "I don't know where we're going from here," he said. "But I know I never want to go back." Celia looked at him, then leaned in gently, resting her head against his shoulder. "Then don't," she whispered. "Just stay." And so he did. By spring, he had quietly moved into the spare room. Lily was the one who declared it Daddy's room, before either of the adults had discussed it aloud. They let her lead the way. That was how it had always been, letting the little girl who had unknowingly saved them both be the compass that brought them home. There were no proposals, no fairy tale endings wrapped in bows. Just days filled with small promises kept, routines shared, and a love that grew not from perfection, but from presence. Andrew had once believed legacy was built in boardrooms, in towers that bore his name. Now he knew it was in moments like this, teaching Lily how to ride a bike, folding Celia's paint-stained apron over the back of a chair, eating pancakes on lazy Sunday mornings. He hadn't just been forgiven. He had been transformed. Not by words, but by the relentless, daily act of showing up. And that, he realized, was what love really was. Not grand. Not sudden. But steady. A second chance, given freely, earned fully. A story rewritten, one page at a time. As the author of this story, I see the ending not as a happily ever after in the traditional sense, but as something deeper and more honest, a redemption that was earned slowly, quietly, through humility and presence. Andrew didn't win Celia and Lily back with grand gestures or flawless apologies, he rebuilt trust one small, consistent action at a time. That, to me, is far more powerful than any dramatic twist or perfect romance. This ending matters because it reflects real life, messy, painful, often uncertain, but full of hope when people choose to grow. Forgiveness isn't magic, it's a process. And love, at its most meaningful, is shown in how we stay, not in how we return. That's the heart of this story.